welcome. My name is Dennis Foretia. I'm the executive chair of the Nkafu Policy Institute, and I really appreciate you all joining us today for this very important conversation. Now, the conflict in Ethiopia, or at least the war, is now in its fourth month. The war that started in November of last year, and the federal prime minister declared the war over back in the end of November 2020. But um, this war could be seen coming from a very long mile away. And it is important for us to have this conversation today regarding where things stand, how we got ourselves to this point, and frankly, what are the options out there that should be entertained, not only by the Tigrayans as well as the Ethiopians, but also partners of Ethiopia and those who are peace lovers and wanting to see peace return to Ethiopia. So today, we are joined by five experts, panelists on this topic. I will start giving brief introduction of each of them. First, Professor Baku. John Mukom Baku is a professor, Brady, distinguished presidential professor at Weber State University. He is also a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, which is based in Washington, D.C. Our next panelist is Ms. Amaka Anku. Ms. Amaka Anku is currently the practice head for Africa at the Eurasia Group, and she is based in Washington, D.C. Next is Mr. Isaias Halemariam. Mr. Isaias Halemariam is the co-chair of the Governance, Peace and Security thematic area of the Global Society of Tigray Scholars, and also in private practice in Berkeley, California, private practice lawyer in Berkeley, California. We do have joining us Mr. Abdullahi Boro Halaye, who is a Horn of Africa expert and currently based in Washington, D.C. And lastly, and certainly not the least, we have Dr. Mesembed Asefa. Dr. Mesembed Asefa is an assistant professor of law at Addis Ababa University based in Addis. So those are the panelists we have. Thank you all very much for joining us. So I will start very quickly with you, Dr. Asefa. You are based in Addis. What is the current situation on the ground in Addis and in Tigray regarding the war? Where do we stand today?
Thank you, Dennis, for the opportunity to speak on this important topic. I hope I can be heard. If there are any connection problems, I'm sure you'll give me a time. But it's a pleasure to be here and to have this distinguished panel of experts speak with me on a very important issue, I would say. So the situation in Tigray, obviously, as you say, the government obviously frames it as a law enforcement operation, but the conflict has been going on for a while. Things now, currently, the humanitarian situation is very dire, obviously, but the government seems to be attending to these humanitarian needs. Currently, I think in terms of the broader context of the political situation in Ethiopia, the security situation, the dire security situation is in Tigray. I think in the rest of the capital here in Addis and the rest of Ethiopia, I think except maybe few spots in Benishangul and some other regions, you don't see any militancy, because one good thing I think the government did was it invited all political parties, including those armed groups, to participate in the next election, which as far as I hear, everyone is, I think, going through that process. The National Electoral Board of Ethiopia, which is led by a very prominent political figure, Burtukan Medeksa, which is a very respected used to be a human rights activist and political figure, is doing a good job, I would say, in terms of handling the electoral process. But the situation in Tigray is a more serious one, and I think That's why we are here. I would believe most of the focus would be on the crisis in Tigray, and like I said, I think we have serious humanitarian situation, obviously, but there are efforts going on, I think, to address that by the governments in coordination with, of course, humanitarian organizations and the United Nations.
Now, Esaias, can you speak in more detail regarding the current humanitarian situation and the broader context? Because there's a lot of reporting regarding serious crimes being committed or so.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Dennis. I think before I begin, let me give you the general idea of what the genesis of this conflict is. First, Ethiopia is, as you all know, is a very diverse nation with, 110 million people, more than 86 ethnic groups, with different psychology, social value, and it's been a federal system of government for almost 27 years without without much problem, just like we're having now. And ever since this prime minister, the current prime minister, took office, things completely changed. First, the prime minister, his main goal or target was just to dismantle the federal system and install a singularity and single political narrative. That was the main problem, the genesis of this problem. And as a result, he started this what he called the law enforcement operation about 3 months ago, and there is a reason why he called it a law enforcement operation, for that matter, because his prime minister and his enablers, they knew that they're gonna be waging war against the people of Tigray and also the people of Oromo, for that matter. So this law enforcement operation is not actually a law enforcement operation. It's just a civil war, and war is governed by international laws, the law of armed conflict. So if he calls this law for what he calls the law enforcement operation a war, he'll be responsible for war because it's governed under international law. So they have to give it a name. The law enforcement operation. That way he can evade being responsible for committing crimes. So these are the two major issues that triggered the current crisis in Tigray. First, the prime minister's desire to form a unitary form of government instead of diverse, plural, ethnic form of federation. And then second is, assuming power without election. Basically, that one of the reasons why this war happened is because the prime minister wanted to rule Ethiopia without being elected. That's the second problem. And I think I disagree with my friend, Professor. The election, the largest ethnic group in Ethiopia is Oromo. Most of the political figures from Oromo are in prison right now. They're in jail. Like almost 40% of Ethiopia is Oromo.
So it says, I hear you. Can you in just in a minute or so paint a picture of the current humanitarian situation?
Oh, the current humanitarian situation in Tigray is very, very desperate and very dire situation. Almost 60,000 Tigrayans are in Sudan right now. Thousands, probably about 50,000 people are estimated to be killed. Women and girls have been raped, gang raped. Even the Minister of Women and Children's Affairs, she admitted that there's been rape committed by the armed soldiers, and the food access to food has been curtailed or limited by the federal government or the prime minister, and access to food has been used as a means of warfare. So the humanitarian situation in Tigray is really very troubling and very disturbing.
Amaka, let me come to you. How do you how are you approaching the conflict in Ethiopia and the current war going on in the Tigray region? What is your global view, your global assessment of the current situation?
I mean, obviously, it's a very complicated conflict, and I would say decades in the making, right? It didn't just start, like you alluded to at the beginning. It's something that we at UAG Group had been watching very carefully. It was always a concern. I think it was always going to be a concern that when you have this kind of transition from what was a fairly oppressive authoritarian regime to something more open, right? Which, obviously there's, as you've already heard, lots of accusations about the current government not being as open as it should be. But that kind of transition is bound to be fraught with issues, right? And so, this is something we had been watching for a while. I think that they were, I'm sure we will hear a lot from the two different sides about how we got here. But there were lots of opportunity from both sides to de-escalate along the way, right? If you look sort of from the perspective of let's start with the TPLF, for example, right? The TPLF and a lot of its politicians had been in a dominant political position for years, right? And so they were bound to feel targeted in a transition that was in part geared at kind of knocking away at their dominance, right? And so there's hardline rhetoric from the government that made some people feel targeted. But on the government side, you can't have a transition without trying to reallocate resources away from what was previously one dominant group to the rest of the population, right? So there was bound to be friction, and we had seen this building, right? It wasn't just what happened. The government says that the TPLF attacked soldiers in the night in their sleep. The reality was that soldiers had been amassing on the borders for days and weeks before the TPLF attacked, right? So there was a lot of tension building up, and we could talk about all the ways in which both sides could have de-escalated. But here we are, and now we're here. And I know that you haven't asked me where we go from here, so I'll stop. But this is how we had been watching it as something as an issue that's concerning. We have a lot of clients who are interested in doing business in Ethiopia, and it's an issue that is extremely complicated with different perspectives.
Thank you. Professor Mbaku, you have studied African economies, great experience in Ethiopia, the Horn of Africa, for more than 3 decades. What is your view, Professor Mbaku, regarding not necessarily the genesis or so, but how the last 2 years of the Prime Minister Abiy's leadership led to did not lead to, or the TPLF response to Abiy's gesture. How did it all play out in the last 2 years to the point where we are here today?
Well, thank you, Dennis, for giving me the opportunity to participate in this program. I think that one of the things that we have to be very careful about when we look at Ethiopia is that Ethiopia has a problem that most African countries have. Kenya, for example, has the same problem. When you have a society made up of ethno-linguistic groups, it's very difficult to put them together and provide a national government that is representative enough to provide opportunities for all these groups to maximize their own interests, for example, in terms of language, bringing up their children, developing their areas, and still have a national system where they can live together peacefully. And I think that to answer your question, if I had been in the position of Prime Minister Abiy and I was trying to bring peace and security to Ethiopia, what I would have done is to bring all Ethiopians together and try to explain to them that federalism, ethnic federalism, as we have it in Ethiopia, is not working very well, primarily because even though it provides opportunities for various groups to have autonomy, you always have this problem where you have political parties that are based on ethnicity. And so whoever emerges as the ruling coalition in Ethiopia is going to be looked upon by other groups that are not part of that coalition with suspicion. It doesn't matter what the members of the coalition are. Every time you have a coalition of ethnic parties managing the government, those other ethnic groups that are not part of that coalition will look at the coalition with suspicion. So the question is, how can you design a government for Ethiopia that does not place itself in a position in which only certain ethnic groups are able to participate at one time and other ethnic groups are not able to participate? In other words, can you have a government in Ethiopia that is not based on an ethnicity? I think that is a problem that if I had been Abiy, I would have sat down with all the Ethiopian people, not just members of, not just representatives of ethnic groups, but with all Ethiopians, and tried to figure out how to move ahead with a government that is representative enough so that that government can never be dominated by any specific ethnic group.
Mhm.
The failure to do so, I believe, made the people of Tigray to become very suspicious of the government in Addis Ababa, and I think that is the beginning of the problem that we have today. Now, if you look at the government, you see that even though Abiy is said to be of Oromo and Amhara origin, the Oromos are not very happy with his government. And you see, this ties back to the argument that is some speakers have already made, and that is that the position that Ethiopia finds itself in is not unique to Ethiopia. If you look at what is happening in Rwanda today, a lot of the Hutus don't trust the government in Rwanda because the government is dominated by the Tutsi. And the same thing you have in Cameroon, where Anglophones don't trust the government because it's dominated by Francophones. So the question that Ethiopia should be asking themselves is the question that every African country with a lot of diversity should be asking themselves: how can you come up with a government that is representative enough so that the government is not dependent on ethnicity as a way to structure itself?
Yeah. So I think that issue of ethnic federalism seems to be at one of the core issues in the current conflict, ethnic federalism and how Ethiopia manages that and where things go from here. Now, Abdullahi, you've been covering the Horn for a very long time. With deep roots in Ethiopia, in Kenya, in Somalia. How do you see the current situation? The current situation, the humanitarian situation, the part about ethnic federalism, the moves and the counter moves that the TPLF made and the Prime Minister are being made. Holistically, how will you surmise where we are today?
Where we are, the question around, nation, nationalities, and people is the question that has animated the Ethiopia's formation. A lot of the time, what we fail sometimes, that goes and acknowledges the fact that Ethiopia, as it currently is, the modern Ethiopia, the country that we call Ethiopia, is a creature of imperial project. Expanding from the highlands towards the southern part of the country. And so therefore, a lot of the time when discussions around, Ethiopia, and particularly after 1991 are hard, these discussions tend to forget that these are the questions that, once the military junta was overthrown, the people who are at the heart of it wrestled with. What do we do with the question of nation and nationalities? Because a lot of the time, it's said that Ethiopia is a prison of nations. You've got about 100 ethnic groups, and how do we address that question? For many faults that can be put at the doorstep of the TPLF, and let's not forget, TPLF was, much as it was a dominant player, it was part of a four-way coalition that involved other groups as well. You know, the Oromos, you know, southern nationalities, as well as the Amaras. And so, much as it was not a perfect solution, right? The, you know, multi-ethnic federalism that was inscribed in the constitution was a solution. We can have debates about, you know, how was it implemented? Was it really implemented? Did TPLF have disproportionate power than the rest? Yes, it did, right? But so the period before TPLF came into power was a period where, you know, it was such a hyper-centralized state. And, you know, the faith that was Orthodox Christian and the language of Amara was the dominant language. Was that helpful? So the debate here for me is, did what we have before TPLF inaugurated, the multi-ethnic federalism, and the period before that, including the imperial time and the Darg time, was it useful? Did communities, did nations and nationalities and people benefit? Did we have cycle of conflict? Did we have problems with famine and all other stuff? So for me, that is the main question. As to how some of these issues will be resolved, I think, you know, both the federal government, the TPLF in the Tigray region will have to make concessions. I mean, the initial discussions right now is everybody is digging their heels, and some of it could just be having a maximalist, you know, negotiating position. But they will have to climb back a little bit from their hardline position and agree to recognize each other, because as it is, the current government, Abiy's term ended the 5th of October. It's been extended because of COVID restrictions, but the other countries, including Ethiopia, Tanzania, Somalia is going to have an election soon. Uganda had an election. Countries have had election. So I think going into the election, so if some of these issues are not resolved, and there are only three ways of this being resolved: total and complete defeat of TPLF, which is unlikely as it is; peaceful settlement, which no party at the moment is very amenable to it; and the other one is a protracted conflict that will go on for long, and I don't think that suits either TPLF or the federal government in Addis.
Thank you for that. Now, Isaias, let me come to you. We're talking about like what we have a major problem. What could be some options or ways in which we can
well, I think first, I completely disagree with some of the comments about you know, being one ethnic group being a dominant. I think that's completely misconstrued, and that's not accurate, because before this current government came for the past 27 years, like if you go back to Ethiopia's history, Ethiopia was an empire once, and most of its history is expressed by dominance of, you know, single political ideology and, you know, a particular group. It's been like one of my friends referred, it was the prison for different ethnic groups. It's just a matter of fact, and that's why Ethiopia has been in civil war for many years, until, you know, the past 30 years. So I think that has to be corrected. After the past regime, which is the APRDF, came to power, different ethnic groups were able to go to school through their own language, attend, you know, court proceedings through their own language, and they were able to administer themselves. So, you know, that one centralized Ethiopia was able to exercise federalism in practically. So I think this has to be noted. And well, you know, it's not, the problem is not ethnic federalism. Actually, it's the perception which is lopsided about, you know, federalism. It's not federalism that's caused all these problems. You know, and, you know, self-determination, as you all know, is one of the fundamental principles. You know, and, you know, it's been enshrined under the UNHCR, for example. It's just a fundamental right, and, you know, different basic human rights documents. I mean,
so Isaias, if I were to push, like, from your perspective, or what do you see as, you know, some of the steps or some of the ways out of the conflict? What are some of the steps? I know the TPLF government, they put out a statement recently regarding what they see as a pathway out.
Well, I think the first, we have to exhaust, all the options. The African Union, for example, IGAD, all these institutions in Africa have failed the Tigray region, obviously, because thousands of people are dying, women being raped, almost 60,000 people, refugees in Sudan. So I think the people of Tigray have been mistreated by the African Union, for example, and the IGAD. The regional institutions have failed Tigray. So I think the next step should be the UN Security Council should interfere and investigate possible violations and also hold perpetrators accountable. I think that's the first step.
Now, Amaka, let me come to you. Now, one of the things that has been very peculiar or very surprising to me is that Prime Minister Abiy, who was universally hailed as a golden boy in the last 2 years or so, does not seem to have any international partners really supporting him currently. You can see statements made yesterday by the EU, the US State Department, major governments around. Did he miscalculate internationally? If not, what is his long-term plan in bringing the region, to under full control, if that's what he's intending to do? And what is your assessment as to some of the way forward? I know those are too many questions, but you can pick and choose.
Right. I don't think it is any international government's role. I don't think it's appropriate for anybody to support a war, right? So if we're looking for that, we won't find it, and we shouldn't, right? I mean, it's a local Ethiopian problem. What we have seen is that I disagree somewhat in the sense that you haven't seen his international partners kind of really crack down, right? Like, no one is withdrawing funding from Ethiopia in any meaningful way, right? No one is. So there's, no one is going to support a war, but there hasn't been an outpouring of, a real dramatic kind of cracking down or taking away things that is really important to the Ethiopian government anyway, right? So I would say the international community are kind of lost as to what to do and how, right, for a problem so complex. In terms of the way forward, right, I think that, like some other people on the call have alluded to, one of the biggest problems is trust, right, is a lack of trust. And not just from within the TPLF, who are politicians, but also in the broader Tigrayan community, right? And I think that it's incumbent on the government, on the Ethiopian government, to start to do its part to really invest in rebuilding trust, right? That could mean, working to restore some, a greater level of stability and security in the areas of Tigray that the government currently controls. Starting to show kind of credible and concrete efforts to rebuild, right? Invested in rebuilding infrastructure, and so on and so forth, ensuring that humanitarian access is coordinated and allowed, right? I mean, we have to kind of remember that Tigray is a region that even before this war, almost 1.6 million people depend on food aid, right? It's a poor region. It's a region that was already, and then you have a locust invasion in East Africa that is coinciding with a harvest. So even without the war, you would have had somewhat of a humanitarian crisis, not as bad as it is, right? So I think that one of the way forward first is really for the government to start to, and also to ensure it does its part to try to control the rhetoric, right? The rhetoric of that tends to devolve into an ethnic blaming, right? So that, make sure that you are being very clear that your target is TPLF and not Tigrayans. Okay. Now on the TPLF side, really, let me wrap up really quickly. On the TPLF side, I do think, and of course we haven't talked about Eritrea here. right? And the Amhara forces. So let's be clear, Abiy doesn't control all the forces in Tigray, right? They're Eritrean forces in Tigray. I mean, officially, they're not acknowledging it, but there are Eritrean forces there. There are Amhara forces there, special forces there. And let's be real. This is very political. Amhara, he needs Amhara.
I have to interfere because a lot of things are like.
It's okay. Sayas, I'll come to you for a minute.
Yeah, let me finish. Abiy politically needs Amhara to maintain his political authority, right? And remember, but one of the things we have to remember is that a part of how we got here was that the TPLF, in a way, was trying to undermine Abiy politically. I think there was a miscalculation about how far he would go, right? Because, he hasn't been a consensus builder. They felt like he was going too fast in kicking out the TPLF. And so if they undermined him, they weren't taking authorities, they weren't taking orders from Abiy anymore, from Addis. They went ahead on the elections. In a way, if they had undermined him politically, it might have maybe led to him losing power, right? So a part of this is also Abiy realizing, well, I need to keep the Amharas on my side. So anyway, all of this to say that there's so many complicated factors in play. And I think in order to really de-escalate, Abiy would have to make a deal even with the Amharas to incentivize them to pull out, same as Eritrea. Okay, on the TPLF side, I do think that it's not clear to me yet. When they came out with this 8-point, request for what they want, they're basically saying they want a return to the status quo, right? Which is not feasible or practical, right? So I think the TPLF also has to show that it is ready to actually arrive at some peaceful conclusion. You're not going to get a return to the status quo, right? And so, it also needs to show good faith in negotiating. So, that's what I would say. It's sort of a way forward. I think that the best that the international community can do is to continue to urge humanitarian access, continue to urge de-escalation, and really urge the Ethiopian government to do its part to rebuild trust with Tigrayans.
So thank you very much, Amaka. Now there is a lot of emphasis on urging the government to do its part, but folks get worried that governments work in funny ways, and somebody like the Rwandan President Kagame is quoted to have said that he doesn't believe that the African Union, has the capability of helping to respond to this, and he believes that it's the United Nations Security Council and the U.S. government to involve. That's what he's quoted, been saying, with the backing that the killings are too many. Now, Kagame knows a thing or two about war,
to say the least.
We can give him that. So before I come to you, Isaias, let me go to Mezembed briefly. How do you see the Ethiopian government managing this going forward? Do they believe, as you had alluded to, that elections will be held? And I know the Tigray region is not involved in these elections anymore, and we know that the Oromias, Prime Minister Abiy is being challenged significantly, and most of his key opponents are in jail and they're on hunger strikes and all of that. How do you see? How is the government looking to manage this going forward?
Thank you, Dennis. Before I go to that comment, I think I want to build on what Professor Mbaku said about the problem of ethnic federalism. I think we cannot undermine. I'm really surprised when Abdullahi said, it had a measure of success. Maybe it could have a limited measure of success in terms of really allowing linguistic minorities to speak their language. But you will never find in the political map of the world, for anyone that studied political science, there is no country in the world that is organized solely on ethnicity. The thing is, the issue that comes to mind is that when you constitute a state, the political structure of a state, how do you manage these different ethnic, religious sentiments and interests? That is a discussion that anyone can have. But taking Kenya as an example, which has maybe a better record of democratic practice, you cannot create a separate state for Kikuyus and the Somalis and the others and try to have a collective consciousness of a state. I mean, that's so laughable. So for me, it's remarkable how we reduce even political arguments like this to simple kinds of, I don't know, how would I say, debates, because the ethnic federal arrangement in Ethiopia, 30 years of federal experiment in Ethiopia has shown that it cannot be sustainable anymore. Because what it brought is that a very divisive, highly sectarian sentiment of every ethnic group. For example, I will tell you a recent phenomenon that is coming in Ethiopia is the rise of, for example, Amhara nationalism, which came as a response to ethnic mobilizations of different ethnic groups. So for a country that defeated colonial ambitions and had a history of statehood for centuries, and it's remarkable because even Tigray state that you talk about currently, you mentioned, Abdullahi, I will challenge you because sometimes the statements that we make have to be very solid historically even. The state of Tigray that we talk about is the epicenter of Ethiopian political history and culture. Read a reading of history of Ethiopian history shows you that. It's not some fringe area of Ethiopia, okay? So we have to make very clear that when you talk about ethnic federalism, the federal experiment, what we have seen is that it has heightened ethnic divisions, hate rhetoric, and animosity. So instead of building a cooperative spirit, which federalism is about, it has created the opposite actually, creating divisions, because the political calculation for me of the inner core of TPLF was that by being power brokers of these large ethnic groups of Amhara and Oromo, they would manage the political and economic power of the state. But that's not going to be sustainable because ultimately there would be more ambitions of democratic demands for economic distribution of power, political power. And that eventually came in actually.
So which part,
for me,
Messenbed,
yes.
How would you suggest, like, what would you suggest will be a way forward for Ethiopia, given
yes, I will speak about that. But Dennis, I wanted to talk about this because even I think speaking about the contemporary political problem in Ethiopia, I see significant misunderstandings by the West and by many commentators. Because
can I respond, please?
No, let me finish and you will respond.
Please.
So the point of the matter for me is that ethnic mobilizations in Ethiopia, you say there are benefits that came about from these political processes, like managing linguistic diversity, allowing people to speak their language, but also it brought heightened kind of animosity and tension, separation, divisive kinds of politics and rhetoric, which was not sustainable. Abiy came in as it was inevitable that this system ultimately would collapse, and it collapsed actually.
Now, just
Abiy is trying to,
is Abiy's centralization the way forward?
Centralization. This is again the point that I'm trying to make.
That seems to be the fight here, whether it's ethnic federalism or a very strong central government.
That's a false dichotomy, Dennis. Okay. Dr. Dennis, that's what I wanted to say. This is a false dichotomy. What Abiy saw was a very fractured state, with no collective consciousness, with no collective kind of understanding of the national unity and cooperative. The cooperative spirit of the state was broken. So Abiy came in as a reconciler, as someone who can find a middle ground. If you consider a centrist, then that's your problem. Okay?
I think
Abiy tried to sound. Let me just finish, Isaias, and then we'll have opportunity to respond.
Misinterpreted, I think I have to respond here because first,
let me finish and then
when the Prime Minister Abiy came, the first thing he did was he waged war on Tigray along with the other one of the ethnic groups that competes with Tigray. So the Prime Minister is not even neutral. The region is invading Tigray region along with the federal forces. So there's conflict.
I understand. I'm just laying down the ideological reasons.
So federal government he's not a reconciler because a reconciler wouldn't invite.
That's your view, and my view is different. That's okay.
War on the other state, and also a reconciler, a peacemaker, would not invite a foreign country, which is Eritrea, and invade Tigray. So this notion of like reconciler is completely wrong. More people are dying now than before in Ethiopia. So I think this is This has to be corrected first.
Let me just finish and then you respond.
We're taking Isaias now. Mesembet, please, in less than a minute, what do you think should be done next?
So very good. So that's I have laid out, I think, the major problem that Ethiopia faced for the past 30, let's say, decades, 3 decades. So now in nurturing Ethiopia's political future forward, even, I'm so surprised because even the Oromia base that you talked about, let's single out some individuals that were, let's say, the figureheads of the political movement. People like Jawar Mohammed, who are incredibly militant. You cannot have, Abiy is trying to nurture, to soften the fractured political divisions in the country. You cannot have a militant political figure currently in Ethiopia and then be able to nurture a future forward in Ethiopia. So that's the most important thing is, yes.
In a nutshell, you're saying that
dialogue is very important. Okay. Dialogue is very important. But Dr. Dennis, we cannot also undermine the significant political problems that we have. Dialogue comes when you believe in democratic principles, Dennis.
May I respond, Dr.
Dennis, I want to respond. I want to respond, Dennis.
And then you can go. This is my last statement.
Let me finish my point.
For political forces like TPLF, with a very communist and almost a fascist-like political stance, it becomes very difficult actually to engage. For me, there are segments of, I think, Tigrayan political elites, both in the diaspora and then domestically, who are still working with Abiy Ahmed's administration, including former TPLF, by the way, members like Arkaba Ukubai. You can have dialogue with these people in nurturing Ethiopia's political future forward. But
all right, so
military attitude, you will never have a future.
Dr. Sefa, I get you. So dialogue with certain groups.
So much.
Dialogue with certain groups of people. That's what Abiy should do. So I'll do a little bit out of order. Abdullahi, I'll give you a minute and a half to respond, and then I'll go to Professor Mbaku and Amaka, and then Isaias.
Thank you. Asefa, I think we've got to be honest. And I think that will help this debate.
And
the idea that hyper centralization will bring unity is an idea that is not founded on reality in Ethiopia's history. Ethiopia, a lot of the time we get hung up.
Abdullah, you are misquoting me again. I never said that. I said he is finding a middle ground. That's what I say. Don't misquote me.
Okay? It's okay. Let's let everybody develop their thinking.
Yeah.
So I think let me just explain.
It says hang in there. It's let Abdullahi finish, please.
Okay.
The idea that before the TPLF, and it's not just TPLF. Let's be very clear. There are 4 major political parties. Yes, TPLF had disproportionate leverage in that 4-way coalition, but it's not just TPLF. The idea that before this formation, Ethiopia was united. I don't think it's supported historically by any form of data. And the idea that ethnic federalism leads to disunity is an idea that is not supported by fact either.
No,
right?
Fact. Tell me a single country organized on ethnicity in the political map of the world. I mean, it's laughable.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Asafa, I gave you time. I gave you time to
don't be dishonest. I have to be dishonest, but you're being dishonest.
No, I gave you time to use your time, And secondly, you mentioned Kenya. Kenya has got devolved authorities. They have got 47 devolved authorities in Kenya. So the idea that it's never worked anywhere, again, Sefa, is not supported by reality. So in effect, much as you wouldn't want to make that very clear, you would rather prefer a centralized state whose history is very rich in terms of the damage that it did to that country. The history of centralized authority, starting with the imperial time, followed by the Derg regime, is very clear. Secondly, the idea that Abiy is somewhat a unifier, a pacifier, I think that is also not supported by facts. Right? The country is more fraught now than before. And I know this debate is largely around Tigray. Tigray is not an exception. What is going in the Oromia region is not very different. When Abiy is going into an election where any reasonable politician, it's very easy for all of us to latch on one individual, right? Jawar Mohammed. How about the rest? They're all in jail. All other parties have been dissolved, and we have the Prosperity Party. How would you say that that is unity, unifying countries? How about winking and nodding and allowing Eritrean military inside Ethiopia? All right. So I think we have to be clear. Nobody would accept the idea that the idea that hyper centralization leads to unity. This I don't think is a correct version of history. Decentralization works in many places.
Thanks very much for that, Abdullahi. Now, Professor Mbako, I want to give you. You've been very patient in this debate, so I want to give you 3 minutes to come regarding the way forward, in the conflict, the different parties or so who need to be involved and how to go about it. And after that, I'll go to Amaka since Amaka needs to run.
Thank you very much. This is a very good conversation, and I think that we need to have more of these conversations. The first thing that I would do is find a way to secure the peace and minimize the humanitarian situation that we have in Ethiopia today, especially in the Tigray area. If it is necessary to secure the cooperation of the African Union or the United Nations to secure the peace, I think that should be done. Once the peace is secured and the humanitarian situation is resolved, then I think the next thing that needs to happen in Ethiopia is Ethiopians, in my opinion, as an outsider, Ethiopians are not yet willing or unable to understand what the problem that they have really is. Because if you look at what is going on in Ethiopia, you can see that the problem that the country has is not unique to Ethiopia. There are a lot of other countries that have the same problem in Africa. The inability to manage groups that were involuntarily brought together either by colonialism, but in the case of Ethiopia, by an imperial government that absorbed several groups and brought them together and formed what is today Ethiopia. Those groups, once they became part of Ethiopia, did not give up their national identities. They did not give up their language. They did not give up their culture. They did not give up their religions. They may have appeared to have done so during the imperial period because of the nature of the oppression that was visited on them by the imperial government. But what we see is that after the Der government was displaced and federalism came about, we were able to see the extent to which nationalities in Ethiopia value their culture, their languages, their system, and so on and so on. So here's where we are now. So you have federalism in Ethiopia, and federalism was supposed to give some level of autonomy to the regional units so that those units could operate without significant tyranny from the center. But so if you're looking at Ethiopia, going forward, one of the things you have to understand is that if we are going to maintain the system in which regional groups like the Tigray and the Oromia have a certain level of autonomy, if we are going to do that, then we have to know that you're going to end up with two types of government in Ethiopia: regional governments and federal government. And regional governments are quite different from federal government, because whereas in a regional government, you can have an ethnic party ruling the region, primarily because the region may be made up mostly of a homogeneous group, which probably is not true. Whereas you can have that kind of a party at the national level, it is not appropriate to have ethnic coalitions govern the country, because no matter how the ethnic coalition is formed, there is going to be suspicion from groups that are not part of that ethnic coalition. Whether the ethnic coalition is Tyrannos or not, doesn't matter. It's a matter of perception. Because you see that all over Africa, if there is an ethnic coalition ruling a country, people who are not part of that coalition immediately begin to look at that coalition with suspicion. And it becomes a matter of trust, because the people who are not part of the government are not going to trust the government, and it will be very difficult for that government to rule the country. That is why political scientists and lawyers will tell you the best coalition to rule the country is a coalition that is not based on ethnicity, but based on political ideas, based on ideology. For example, a coalition that may be based on human rights, entrepreneurship, and so on and so on. All right. So my idea is that the way forward for Ethiopia is secure the peace, seek reconciliation, and then bring all the groups together and sit down and try to get them to understand this basic idea that Ethiopia will not be able to have a peaceful transition unless the group that rules the country is not based on an ethnic coalition, but based on political ideas. And so that particular political coalition that is going to rule Ethiopia must be one that allows membership from everybody within Ethiopia and is not based on ethnic groups. If they do that, I think they'll be moving forward in the right direction.
Isaiah's 1 minute. Amaka needs to get out of bed. Amaka, as this conversation heats up, what is your way forward? I think Professor Mbako has outlined a string of points there.
Let me just build on what Professor Mbaku said, and also just weigh in on the debates earlier. I mean, I have to add that, I do think we need to move away from this dichotomy between, hyper-centralized state and ethnic-based groupings, right? Look, I'm from Nigeria. We have over 250 ethnic groups. I do not think it is productive to base our politics around our ethnicity. The reality is that in order to have any level of development in any country, you need to build a national consensus. You need to build a national vision. You need to have some consensus around policy. That is very difficult to do if your politics is based on ethnicity. In fact, it's very much like what's happening in the US now, just to throw that in there, right? When people are so focused on their cultural identities, that becomes the politics, like the conservative versus liberal. You can't get anything done. The US hasn't been able to tackle infrastructure, healthcare, climate change for years. Obviously, the US is a developed economy. It has a different impact on the US than it would on a developing country, right? So look, in order to have development, there needs to be a certain level of nation building, right? And so that, because otherwise, all the ethnic this, ethnic that, it will suck all the air out of the room. So now, this is not to say, and the other thing I would say now, that said, right, I do think it can be that dichotomy. The DERG didn't work, and you can also say this is not working. It's not ideal. It doesn't mean go back to what was there before. Now, I do think that saying that Abiy is a unitary, is centralist, I do think that's an oversimplification. I think Abiy needs to do a better job of actually articulating what his vision is. I think that, I do think, but if you read between the lines, it seems like he is saying that this is not working, right? This is not ideal. Now, what we need to do is figure out what will work. I do think there's a role for some kind of national dialogue. Look, this is a country that has been through, decades of oppressive rule under the DERG, under the EPRDF, and so on and so forth. You can't move forward without reckoning with that past. Right? Without naming and shaming and having some national consensus around these things were bad, right? Like the persecution of these minority groups was not ideal. All the things that have been done in the past, you have to reckon with it, right? Have some justice for it, and then you can move forward. I do think that that needs to be a part of the conversation. And I think that where Abiy has failed is that he hasn't been a consensus builder, right? He's had a vision, but he's been, he needs to slow down and figure out how to build consensus and bring people along and articulate his vision and get buy-in and support for it, right? And that could just be a personality issue, right? Like it can be. So there needs to be a balance between, I don't think he's saying centralist, but he needs to do a better job of communicating that and bringing people along. Thank you very much, Dennis, for having me. I hope everybody, stay calm, have a great conversation, and hopefully we'll come up with some solutions. All right. Bye, guys.
Thank you very much, Amaka. Isaias, let me come to you because you've been very patient. And, I appreciate that.
More time. So
go ahead, please.
Okay. So first, I think we have to correct some of the misconceptions. First, the notion that Abiy is a reconciler, is a peacemaker, is completely wrong because he is the prime minister. As soon as he assumed power, he started war with Sudan. He's the problem behind Kenya and Somalia. Thousands of soldiers have been involved in Ethiopia's war. So basically, he's destabilizing the region. I think he's one of the only leader in the world with a PhD in conflict resolution, and also the only person to start 3 different wars at the same time. So it's just completely, everything you're thinking about Abiy is completely wrong. So we have to correct that first. And second, the current crisis in Ethiopia, the African Union has failed, IGAD has failed. To solve intricate and complicated problem like this, you have to have an institution that can solve problems. So first, the African Union is a failed institution. Most of you are legal scholars. So Article 4H of the African Constitution, it permits a member nation, if there is any serious or grave human rights violation, the union can intervene. That's what the law says. That's what the Constitution says. However, Moussa Faki hasn't been doing anything at all. Thousands of people are dying, starvation, rape. Where's the African Union? Where's IGAD? The Constitution permits the union to intervene, but Moussa Faki lives 700 kilometers away from Tigray, right there. He's not doing anything at all. If the union can't solve this problem, why would you expect the African Union to solve Chad's or Kenya's or Somalia's problem? So first, the African Union has failed. And second, and the most important point is the UN Security Council should intervene. There's no question about that because local remedies have been exhausted already, and the African Union is not able or is not willing to resolve this problem. So the UN Security Council must intervene. And there are reasons for that. First, this is an international conflict involving different nations. There is international human rights law has been violated. The government in Ethiopia is using food as a method of warfare, which is the violation of international law. And also, more than 20,000 Eritrean refugees in Tigray have disappeared. We don't know where they are. This is an international law violation as well. And again, the African Union is not willing to resolve the problem in Tigray right now. So all these factors, demand a solution, and that solution is the UN Security Council must intervene, and there has to be an independent investigation of the crimes violated in Tigray, and ultimately, the only institution in the world that can solve this problem is the United Nations, the only independent institution, because Abiy is not willing and able to resolve the problem because he's part of the problem. He's siding with one of the ethnic groups and invading the other ethnic groups. So first, the Abiy administration is not in a position to resolve the current crisis in Tigray. So this is the most important point. And I think finally, we have to all know that Tigray, the crisis in Tigray is it's just beyond imagination. Tons of people are starving as we talk right now, and this government is blocking aid from reaching to Tigray. So how on earth will can you assume that this is a government? Actually, even an enemy, even a colonizer wouldn't do that. So I think because of all these factors, the local institution, the African Union and IGAD have failed, obviously. So the only stone left unturned is using the Security Council intervene and take immediate action.
Thank you very much, Isaias, for that. Thank you very much. Now, Abdullahi, let me bring you in. Because the Finnish foreign minister was recently in Ethiopia, Sudan, trying to and reported to the European Council. I think it was yesterday or so. And one of the things said was that 80% or so of the Tigray region, folks there were unreachable. And there is information blackout. Humanitarian situation is dire. We know that Sudan and the Sudanese military has people have said has taken advantage of the problem to make some major moves. We also know that the middle powers, Saudi Arabia, UAE, are flexing their muscles in various ways. And when you look at the Horn, and you look at the crisis, how do you think this has the potential of getting out of control? Do you think what do you think is the real humanitarian cost in the Tigray region? How do you think the various forces, Amhara forces or so, the Eritreans can be brought under some level of control? It's a loaded question with many angles. So,
no, thank you. I think we got caught up in the earlier part, and this is an equally very important part about the crisis in Tigray. Whatever happens in one of the Horn countries hardly stays in that country, and so the potential of the Tigray crisis bleeding into other countries is a very important consideration. Because let's just take an easy, and probably not easy, but I mean, like one of the angles is, the Eritreans being involved, although both Ethiopia and Eritrea have denied, but there are credible evidence to suggest that they have been involved. That is another key actor that is being involved. There is a boundaries dispute between Ethiopia and Sudan. And that around the El-Fashaga Triangle, and that region is largely occupied by the Amharas. And the Amharas are a very significant constituency for Abiy. But Sudan is an incredibly important two ways, not just in this conflict, in the sense that because the TPLF, if this crisis were to get protracted, they will need supplies. On the other side, Eritrea, they will never get a chance. The only supply route is via Sudan. So if Abiy trades the Al-Fashaga region, which which Sudan think that is very important, and they might get it, and they have all the reasons they could get it, that would mean Abiy will have to trade one for the other. It's not just because of the supply route for the TPLF, but also in the discussions around the Renaissance Dam. So I think there are so many actors just in the region that are involved. And if you take it a little bit higher, the Gulf countries, particularly after the Gulf crisis, the region has become a huge playing ground for them. I mean, look at what is happening in Somalia, which was meant to have an election the 8th of this month, and that hasn't taken place. The level of involvement of not just Qataris and United Arab Emirates, but also Saudi Arabia, and if you add into that mix Turkey, you're looking at a region that, during the Cold War, it was the supremacy battle between the US and USSR. But now as we speak, it's not just those two countries, but it is all these constellation of other countries. The trouble is, most of these relationships that, the Gulf countries build are largely predicated on what you call, Czech diplomacy. It's not built on any institution. It's just knowing one country or the other. And UAE, because they're trying to build us or decongest Dubai, and they're building all these ports in most of these countries, it is going to be an incredibly big player. And we've seen what UAE has done in other parts of the world. Look at what is happened, what is happening in Yemen, what is happening in Libya. So I think there is a serious worry that if this is not addressed, either through IGAD and AU, I know Isaias, have a very strong disagreement on whether these institutions would be able to resolve this. The trouble is, outsiders can only do so much. And I'll always, caution ourselves against expecting them to do much. And this is where the trouble is in the region. Which are the countries that can bring, TPLF and Abiy to power together to have a dialogue that is not going to be very easy. It's going to be very difficult. I understand from the TPLF side that this is somebody who waged war against us in conjunction with Eritrea. We will not have dialogue. But there will have to be a political agreement in order to resolve this. TPLF cannot say Abiy is, or they will not recognize Abiy or any government that will be elected in June. And, Addis cannot continue digging its heels saying that they will not recognize the TPLF government. This is a government that has been elected by the Tigray population. You cannot say you cannot recognize. And that requires a little bit of faith. That requires a little bit of courage. And, the current, rhetoric of, we will deal with this, whether you call it, law and order operation, will not wash. And I think so. This is where the political leadership inside Ethiopia, both Tigray and Addis and the regional countries, through either multilateral organizations, UN, AU, and IGAD, need to be able to help Ethiopia to resolve this. Short of that, we've seen this play out, and it doesn't end well, and it doesn't end well for either parties in the long run.
Yeah, I totally agree. Now, Professor Mbaku, when we look at the reality that the TPLF government was an elected government, they had their regional elections. You can agree to disagree.
I'll make comments on that also, Dennis.
That's okay.
Give me a chance.
That's okay. The Prime Minister Abiy is planning an election for later this year, and there will be an outcome there. Sometime soon, or sooner or later, there has to be some form of negotiation. When you look around the horn and the different players or institutions or individuals who could help broker some kind of negotiation for peace, what comes to mind? What kind of frameworks come to mind for you regarding how a process could be framed, the players that need to be involved, and also concessions that may have to be made?
Well, the thing is, we have to understand that what is happening in Ethiopia is an Ethiopian problem. If that problem is to be solved, it must be solved by Ethiopians. We have to be very careful, especially when it comes to African issues, bringing in external actors, primarily because no matter who the external actor is, whether it is the UN or the United States, as you can see, the way the previous Trump administration handled the dispute between Egypt and Ethiopia and Sudan, you see there that the US went in pretending to be interested in resolving the problem, when in reality, the US was trying to maximize its own interest. So it doesn't matter what external group you bring in, that external group is going to have a different angle. So when there is a problem in Africa, in an African country, the members of that country have to understand, the citizens of that country have to understand that the solution has to come from them. And the reason is people have to buy into the solution. If you impose a solution externally, the chances are people are not going to buy into that solution. That's the first point. The second point is that the negotiation that has to happen in Ethiopia to resolve the present conflict should not be framed as a discussion between Abiy and the TPLF. The problem involves virtually all the groups in Ethiopia. And so if there's going to be a solution, we have to understand that the war between Tigray and the Ethiopian National Forces is just a symptom of what is wrong with Ethiopia, what is going on within Ethiopia today. And so we can use that opportunity to have a national dialogue that includes everybody, taking into consideration the massive human rights violations that have taken place in Tigray as a result of the war, and understand that a war is usually not the first way to solve a problem. And I think regardless of how we look at Abiy, we have to keep in mind that when there is a problem within the country, the best way to approach the problem is to try to negotiate, bring everybody together and talk. Dialogue is very important. But sometimes things break down primarily because of this obsession with elites. Ethiopia is not alone. Many African countries tend to think that as soon as you negotiate with some person who claims to be representing a group of people, then that is the end of the solution. When you have a problem, you should not only talk to the elites, you should also talk at the ordinary people who are the ones who end up suffering from the problem. So it's important that the people of Tigray be given an opportunity to provide input into how the way forward should be for Ethiopia. And the people of Oromia, all the other regions within the country should be involved in this particular dialogue. But what we need to do right now, as we are talking, is to try to resolve the humanitarian crisis that is taking place in Tigray. Because if we don't, there's going to be long-term consequences that can create a situation in which Ethiopia may not be able to come back safely from this problem. It may take more than 50 years for them to come back if we allow people in the region to continue to suffer, regardless of how we feel about the TPLF or how we feel about Abiy. We have to understand that the solution, the way forward, is for there to be some kind of dialogue so that Ethiopians can come up with a government that they can trust. And I want to, before I conclude, I need to remind ourselves of this thing that I've mentioned earlier, and that is you cannot have a federal government in any African country that is based on ethnicity. But you should not abolish ethnicity the way the people of Rwanda are trying to do. They are trying to abolish ethnicity. You cannot abolish ethnicity. It's not a proper way forward. What you need to do is to emphasize the fact that political parties at the federal level must be based on ideology, must be based on economics, must be based on ideas to develop the country, so that membership is not based on ethnicity. If you do it that way, then you are not going to have the kinds of ethnic coalitions that you have in Ethiopia ruling the country, which are subject to suspicion by groups that are not part of that ethnic coalition. And of course, if you are an ethnic leader in Ethiopia, if you are in Addis Ababa, the people you are representing, who are your fellow ethnics, they expect you to do whatever is necessary to bring resources back to them at home. So no matter how magnanimous you might be, no matter how nationalist you might be, you're not going to stay there long enough, because the people you represent, who are your fellow ethnics, would want you to abandon the rest of Ethiopia and only pay attention to them. That is why I keep emphasizing that a federal government in Ethiopia must be a government not based on ethnicity, but based on ideas, based on development.
Thank you very much, Professor Mbaku. Really appreciate that national dialogue, especially reviewing the ethnic federalism or so. And I'll go just 1 minute for Mezembed, and 1 minute for Isaias, and 1 minute for Abdullahi. That way we can close. Thank you, Mezembed.
Thank you, Dr. Janice. I think Professor Mbaku has made my job very easy, because he has said exactly what I wanted to convey in this webinar. I think the first thing is, as Professor said, the humanitarian situation should worry us in Tigray. I have been personally speaking about that. But you know, there was a professor who said the nature of things does not madden us, but only ill will does madden us. In a way, it's very tragic what's happening in Tigray. But if you consider in terms of moral, who takes the moral responsibility for the consequences of this war, I think that has to come out very clear. Abiy, for many months, was trying to be very pacifist and trying to contain any involvement in a full-fledged kind of armed conflict. That's very clear, I think, if for anyone that closely follows the political developments here. So for many, I think for some miscalculation, the TPLF tried to engage for various factors in a military confrontation, and of course, quickly escalated into a conflict, which has dire humanitarian consequences now. And however political positions that we have, I think we need to support the humanitarian effort in Tigray. I fully support that. I'm sure Isaias, including all the speakers, would agree with that, and I concur with that as well. I will be very clear, I think. You can say that there are many political problems in countries like Ethiopia, but for me, as Professor Mbako has said, organizing any political society on ethnicity is doomed to fail. It's remarkable because I challenged Abdullahi as a brother. He mentioned the 47 counties in Kenya. They are not organized on ethnicity. There are many Ethiopians, actually, intellectuals in Ethiopia that believe in federalism, and most even, so to say, unionist kind of oriented political parties and positions support federalism, actually. What we challenge is when you organize societies on ethnicity. For anyone that observes political developments in Ethiopia, banks are named after ethnic groups. Sports clubs are named after, it's remarkably shocking. So for any plausible path, for anyone, for any political society, that's why even the name political society itself indicates that we have collective consciousness. Unless your scope of justice is wider, you cannot address the developmental ambitions, the democratic ambitions, the human rights ambitions of the constituent tribes. And a reading of political history and political theory absolutely will tell you that. You can read Fukuyama's readings, you can read Amartya Sen's reading on violence and identity. They all say that you can never organize ethnicity. Because I wanted to emphasize that, Dennis, on this, we need to have moral clarity on some of the issues that we mentioned.
Thank you very much.
We need to nurture that.
Thank you very much.
Maybe on the solutions, a few words, if I can say.
You have 5 seconds. You can use speak for 5 seconds.
So I think we all believe in political dialogues. That should be the path forward. I think any genuine, by the way, Isaias would also agree that when Abiy actually took over power in 2018, Tigrayans were also even jubilant because they saw a decadent political party called EPRDF, who is not even solving the problems of the Tigray people. I agree with my sister that Abiy's fault lines are rather following up and articulating his political vision. I see a problem in that, but I hope he nurtures that as we go in finding political solutions in Ethiopia.
Thank you very much.
I definitely feel he has the right path.
Thank you very much, Mezenbe. Now, I say in a minute, where do we go from here?
Thank you very much, Dr. Dennis. So first, I think I disagree with Mezenbe. When the Prime Minister came to power, the reason why the people of Tigray cheered for him, most of them, was not because of his ambition, but actually they thought a true federalism would come, like better federalism than they had before. So that's the reason why most Tigrayans supported him. So that's just a misconception. So don't put words in my mouth, Brother Mezenbe. So, and second, Tigray has an elected government. So every time we talk, you're saying that TPLF. I'm not talking about TPLF or representing any political organization. What I'm telling you is the Tigray region has elected the TPLF. Like with the vast majority of them, like 2.7 million people voted for TPLF. So it's an elected government. And the reason why the Prime Minister postponed the election, citing COVID-19, is completely, it's just a propaganda. First, he postponed the election, citing COVID-19. However, in Ethiopia, there is huge demonstration in support of the Prime Minister. Like thousands of people crowded, they're just coming out. They don't care about the impact of COVID-19. So everything about the election, the postponement, etc., is just it's just a drama. And second, to solve Ethiopia's problem, the Prime Minister he's unable and unwilling to resolve it because it's just against natural justice. You can't be the source of a problem and at the same time become a mediator. It's just impossible because he's the one waging war against Tigray, and at the same time he can't resolve Ethiopia's problems. And again, regarding federalism, political power, as most of emanates from below, from people, from states, from the local government. Those local governments form federal governments. I mean, in Ethiopian context, so that means power comes from below. So that means the ultimate source of power is the people from below. So I think in that case, taking power from people and forming a strong federal government that suppresses different ethnic groups, different ideology, it's just impossible. That's just a recipe for destruction. And my final suggestion is that this is an international war. Multiple countries are involved: Ethiopia, Somalia, Sudan, Eritrea. This is an international war. There's international human rights violation, and there is lack of political willingness from Abiy to resolve this problem. And again, there's genocide, crimes against humanity already committed. So all these situations demand the interference of or the UN Security Council and are very intervening in Ethiopia's current situation. Otherwise, Ethiopia will be doomed to fail. This is, my last recommendation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that. Abdullahi Memeni, please.
Yeah, thank you. I want to end on a nice note with Sefa. I don't want him to go back and feel like we are not friends. We are friends, Sefa. The thing is, in all honesty, as fraught as this discussion that we are having are, it just shows how, this question has been the question at the heart of the discussions that Ethiopia and Ethiopians and people who care for Ethiopia have had. It's the question that for the latter part of 20th century is the question that everybody has been struggling with. It's not a new question. It's a question that it's the reason why it's fraught is it's very, very important. The reason why it's fraught is it's a question that is incredibly loaded because of Ethiopia's rich history around this question. I mean, as early as 1969, Makanen was having probably one of the earlier one, the question of nationalities in Ethiopia, where he laid out some of these things. That's why I was very careful not to use the word ethnicity, because it is a question. These were distinct nations before they were absorbed into the empire. And if you look at the Constitution doesn't speak about ethnicity. The Constitution speaks about nation, nationalities, and people, because it is what constitute, the bigger Ethiopian nation that we are speaking. I want to say two things probably before we leave. One is, I wish she was here, our sister, she's left, and the question that the prof brought about. We cannot form, a united country on ethnicity, but this is where we are now. I'm born and raised in Kenya. Every electoral cycle in Kenya, if you follow it very closely, we say, oh no, we don't want political parties that are based on this. But unfortunately, this is where we are. These are not theoretical abstracts. These are our current reality. So we need to be mindful. We need to reimagine how some of these things can be put to a better use. There is no point in having a unity that is just in name, a unity that just, it's only one ethnic group, language, culture, and everything that is promoted at the expense of the rest. Finally, is the question about, Abiy not being able to, express his vision very well. I have a fairly different opinion, to be honest with you. Abiy is probably one of the most curated leader in the world. His image is very well curated online and offline. And so the idea that he's not able to express himself very well, I find that, incredibly hard to reconcile with, and so Abiy is very clear in his head. Abiy has the nostalgia for an imperial era that doesn't exist. Imperial era that he speaks in very glowing terms. But if you ask people who have borne the brunt of the empire, they will have different ideas. And when I speak about, empire, is not just, that
Abdullah,
is.
where did you bring the idea of Abiy being
So
an empire builder?
Abdullah,
I thought we were trying to end on a nice note,
I think
except for we are friends.
yeah, but he never said that. I think you have to be very clear in terms of the fact.
Thank you, Abdullah. Please just conclude. That way we can.
My brother Dennis, I have concluded. I just wanted to say, thank you to all the panelists, including Asafa, Professor, Isaias, and everybody. I'm sorry if I said something that came across that maybe that hurt anybody. It wasn't my intention. Disagreement in a very professional way is how some of these things can be solved. We don't have to agree with each other. We can have different ideas about the same issue, but at least keep that as respectful as possible. I would love to continue discussing these issues if in future forums whenever we get a chance. And I wish everybody the best of luck. Thank you, and again, thank you to the Institute for inviting us.
Well, thank you very much, Abdullahi. Thanks, Professor Mbaku. Thanks, Mesenbet. Thanks, Isaias, and Ms. Anko. And I think this has been a very great conversation. Now, the humanitarian situation is extremely dire. It's extremely important that humanitarian aid is allowed to get into the Tigray region. It's important for dialogue, as Professor Mbaku and many others have alluded to. The foundations of the state definitely need refounding, or else this conflict will just metastasize into something else, and we'll be talking about it again. The foundation of the state is extremely important. I want to thank our team. Thanks to Ansel, Omerine, and all the team members who have been able to put this. And again, thank you to our panelists, and I hope we continue this conversation because the situation is extremely dire. So please have a good one. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.